Dear Scott Cawthon, I've been a fan of Five Nights at Freddy's since the first game came out. I played all of the games, watched all of Markiplier's Let's Plays, Freddy! And all of MatPat's theories. Naturally, as a huge fan of FNAF, I'm also a huge fan of yours. That being said, it's time to stop. We need to stop pretending that Five Nights at Freddy's creator Scott Cawthon had some grand plan in mind when he was making these games, because he didn't. He said he didn't.
I did not have the entire story planned out, as I know there's much debate about that on the subreddit. It's like, oh, he's some kind of mad genius that had, 7 games planned out from the beginning. No, I didn't.
We need to stop fooling ourselves into believing that all the FNAF games can be tied together into a singular coherent story, because they can't. Most importantly, we need to stop acting like we're just one discovery away from a massive revelation that will solve FNAF and connect everything together. We aren't, because there is no answer. There's no grand design here. Solving FNAF just comes down to explaining what happened, and the truth is, we already know what happened at this point. See these two puppies? Subscribe. Subscribe to Theft King. Prior to the release of Sister Location, and shortly after the release of the first FNAF book, The Silver Eyes, Scott made the following post clarifying whether or not the book was canon. This statement was problematic because Scott danced around the question, ultimately saying that the book is canon just as the games are. That doesn't mean they're intended to fit together like two puzzle pieces. The book is a reimagining of the Five Nights at Freddy's story. More importantly though, he clarified that the games are what they are, and as I stated before, that story is finished. There it was, straight from Scott himself. FNAF 4 was the end of the original FNAF story, and any subsequent games would take place in a separate continuity. Sadly, Scott would not keep his word. Just under a year later, Sister Location would be released, and it absolutely continued the story of the prior games. This left a lot of fans confused and upset. Even MatPat seemed kinda pissed about it.
Your version of events isn't satisfying. That any theory I come up with that attempts to bend over backwards and cobble together every line of dialogue, design detail, and character motivation will be overcomplicated at best and inherently flawed at worst. And that's not me admitting defeat, it's a fundamental problem with the series right now. This one just tried too hard to do too many things. You've got elements of the past 4 games mixed in with FNAF World, mixed in with the book, all of which at this point have questionable canonicities, conflicting storylines, and competing dates. Couple that with characters that mimic other characters that lie to you, and characters that may not even exist across the different story threads of the franchise, and it's unclear if this is a continuation of the books, if it's a continuation of the games, or just an outright reboot of some kind.
Mixing book and game lore in a nebulous, arbitrary way, yeah, that happens constantly.
I know, I said the B word. I'm sorry, but stick with me, this one's different.
For every Fazbear Fright story MatPat cherry picks out and tries to solve the game lore with, there are countless other stories that are completely ignored. We have storylines that conflict with each other, we have characters that mimic other characters, we have characters that lie to us, we have characters that might be critically important to the game's timelines yet might not even exist, we don't know.
The best analogy I can think of is that it's like the giant human glob you turn into at the end of Inside. A mass of limbs all struggling to work together to move in one direction, but all just flailing out randomly.
Holy crap, MatPat literally predicted the blob at the end of Security Breach 6 years ago. The reality is, you can't solve FNAF in a satisfying way. Not anymore. What does solving FNAF even look like? Countless people have tried to come up with coherent timelines that account for everything, but these inevitably necessitate devastating compromises. As a result, modern FNAF timelines just kinda suck. They aren't telling a compelling story anymore. Instead, they treat FNAF like a math problem that's meant to be solved for the sake of being solved without any consideration for how ridiculous it is. People are so desperate to line the puzzle pieces up, they've lost sight of what it was that made the early game theory FNAF timeline so compelling in the first place. 6 years ago, when this Game Theory episode came out, FNAF was exploding. We'd just gotten the first book, and FNAF World had released, suggesting that Scott no longer intended to leave the series concluded with FNAF 4's Dream Theory ending. This left FNAF lore in a really weird place. The game's story was left unresolved after Scott abandoned Dream Theory, yet now we had this book that for all intents and purposes was set in a different canon, but we also had FNAF World which seemed to tie to the books. It was confusing. This led to Sister Location, the introduction of the Aftons, and Circus Baby. For all intents and purposes, it really did look like FNAF was leaving the first 4 games to rest with an ambiguous ending and moving on. I went into Sister Location assuming it was a reboot. I mean, Scott said the story he was telling in the first 4 games was over, it was finished. Unfortunately, for some strange reason, Scott made one decision that threw the FNAF community into chaos: the 1983 code in Sister Location's secret ending.
It could have been easy. With Scott saying that the original story was completed with FNAF 4, we could have just said that Sister Location was aligned with the book and FNAF world to start paving the way for the movie. But then you couldn't help yourself, Scott. You just had to throw in those FNAF 4 Easter eggs, huh? And those put everything into chaos.
This was a big deal. By including this reference, Scott was explicitly confirming that Sister Location took place in the same continuity as FNAF 4, that it was a continuation of that story, and thus invalidated Dream Theory. Unfortunately, this is where the story started to get insane. The FNAF 4 box had gone unopened, and the community hated Dream Theory, so for many of us, the first 4 games had no satisfying conclusion. Suddenly, we had this tiny clue hidden away in Sister Location that potentially recontextualized everything. Thus, instead of focusing on the new lore and new characters that Sister Location and the books had introduced, everyone became laser focused on puzzling out exactly how everything was connected to the earlier games. MatPat presented a very plausible explanation that connected Sister Location to FNAF 4, suggesting the psychic friend Fredbear holding the camera remote implied that someone, presumably Afton, was spying on the crying child through the Fredbear plushies throughout the game. The problem was that FNAF 4 explained the prior 3 games as being dreams, so while Sister Location now had a direct connection to FNAF 4, which was no longer a dream, the events of FNAF 1 through 3 still needed to be explained. If those games weren't the crying child's dreams, how were they connected to FNAF 4 and Sister Location? What were they trying to tell us? The truth is, nothing. They don't tell us anything. We learn that some kids were murdered, stuffed in suits, and that they became haunted. The details though? Phone Guy, Mike Schmidt, Golden Freddy, It's Me, the victims themselves, the toy animatronics versus the older ones, the retro arcade minigames. None of those things really matter to the FNAF story we have today, yet it still insists on connecting itself to the older games at every opportunity. If the original story had ended with FNAF 4, they'd just be dreams, but even despite Scott abandoning that idea, had the games ended with FNAF 6, they'd still be minuscule side notes that were ultimately trivial to the story that game is telling, the story of Henry and the Aftons. For some reason though, the FNAF games continue to torture us with tiny little callbacks to the old lore, Easter eggs that tempt us into believing maybe Scott is gonna pull something amazing off and tie up the FNAF story in a way that preserves the integrity of the earlier games whilst opening up the lore for new unconstrained stories. We have the first missing children's incident, the second missing children's incident, a list of victims' names that never amounted to anything meaningful or significant. We have theories that ignore nearly everything from Fazbear Frights, yet try to integrate characters like Charlie from The Silver Eyes, a long concluded storyline that even the books have moved on from. Then we get timelines that do try to integrate Fazbear Frights. It's like a free-for-all. Scott clearly felt constrained by the mountains of unresolved lore from the earlier games, saying, sometimes the lore of something can become so crowded that you can't tell an original story anymore. Yet at the last second, he deliberately shackled himself to that old crowded story yet again. Now Security Breach has done the same thing with the Blob and Afton, and I really wish we'd just had a clean break between FNAF 4 and Sister Location. I wish that MatPat's Sister Location theories had emphasized the new characters and the new story rather than obsessively trying to tie it back to the old games. Unfortunately, that's not what happened, and in spite of that, FNAF 6 did as good a job as one can tying everything together. Today though, we find ourselves in a similar situation. Will the Ruin DLC move the FNAF story forward, focusing on Gregory, Glamrock Freddy, Vanessa/Vanny, Patient 46, and the new protagonist? Or will it continue to look back, playing on our nostalgia for the earlier games, despite them not having any substantial impact on Security Breach's lore? For the sake of my sanity, I really hope they just let the old lore die and do something new. Please guys, there's no satisfying way to connect Security Breach to the earlier games. You don't need to play on our nostalgia to keep people interested in FNAF. If anything, constantly rehashing the same tired story over and over again is getting old, and people are getting tired of it. Theories have become stale and incomprehensible to all but the most devout fans, and the community is constantly fighting over the implications of every little thing. He already tried to end the current storyline once with Dream Theory, then again with FNAF 6, then again with Ultimate Custom Night, then again with Help Wanted and Steve Theory and the idea that the earlier entries were literally indie video games in-universe. Scott, Steel Wool, it's time to let it go. Just start telling a new story. Don't worry about tying up every little loose end. It's impossible. FNAF has always thrived as a mystery game where we try to piece together what happened. It's time to give us a new mystery to solve because we already know what happened in the original games, and no amount of recontextualizing them is ever going to get people as excited as we were back when they first came out and we knew nothing about this story. Now that we know what happened, I just don't care that much about those old games anymore. I want to see the new stuff. Ask yourself this right now. What does it mean to solve FNAF? What does solving FNAF even look like?
Was that the bite of 87?
Are there really any mysteries from the earlier games that you care about anymore? Personally, I'm over it. Afton killed the kids, stuffed him in the suits, they got haunted, he got spring-trapped, and eventually Henry and Michael lured him and the other animatronics to the FNAF 6 location where they were burned. The trapped souls were freed, whereas Afton burns for eternity. The end. Can we just move on now?